Hello, I'm Larry Johnson. Welcome to this episode of Countercurrents. Um, Today I will be just myself. Tough to follow up after having Roger Waters on the last episode. The issue before us are the looming talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Uh, the proposal for having that meeting came from the United States, not Russia, what we're told in some of the latest reports. While I was skeptical initially that this meeting would even come off, it does appear that it is set for next week, date to be determined still, in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. But I think in discussing what can come of this meeting, it's important to, accurately assess where each side is coming from. I think uh, from Vladimir Putin's standpoint, he's interested in meeting with Trump in order to explain to Trump face to face exactly what Russia's concerns are. And we frequently hear from Russia the root causes, which I've talked about before. And the root cause is very simple: NATO expansion to the east. That has to be stopped and even rolled back as far as Vladimir Putin's concerned. Um, this is not about the way the West is approaching this is as if this is something about territorial concessions. Okay, if we just recognize Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson as Russian territory, then the problem's over, and Crimea, we don't have to worry anymore. That's not the issue at all. The issue remains NATO's expansion, NATO's use of Ukraine as a proxy army to attack Russia, and the presence of the neo-Nazi ideology, which now governs Ukraine, at least at the government level. Not necessarily saying the majority of people embrace it, but it is the hallmark of the government in Ukraine. That must come to an end. So Putin's ability to explain to Trump, and I would suggest it might even take along the same treaty that he had presented, the draft treaty he had presented to Joe Biden back in December of 2021 as a solution for bringing an end to this conflict. Because it's not just about stopping the war, it is about putting an end to the militarization that is taking place in Europe. Not in terms of actually building up armies, but the rhetoric that's coming out of Germany, out of France, out of England, all harken back to an era of like World War II, where in this case, though, Russia is seen as the enemy. Sergei Lavrov made the comment last week that for the first time in history, he felt that Russia was standing against the West without any ally in the West. It wasn't to suggest that he had no allies with China, no alliance with China or with South Korea or with North Korea or even with Iran. There are other countries that are friendly to Russia and support Russia. But this is the first time in the West that there has been this, what Russia perceives as this unified attack on it. What was curious in the timing yesterday with the talks between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin is that Trump issued an executive order titled Addressing Threats to the United States by the Government of the Russian Federation. Now, to declare that Russia poses a threat, and in terms of immediate threats that require executive order action to circumvent Congress, is just ridiculous. This is simply Donald Trump reacting, or he wants to put tariffs on India. But to do that, you have to have an immediate national security threat. And so he's claiming that the threat that Russia poses, without identifying what that threat is, but the fact that India is buying oil from Russia, that this ultimately is somehow a threat to the United States. Uh, this will ultimately go before a court. I think it'll be tossed out because it's just so ridiculous on the face of it. But Trump, in sending this kind of message, it gives is the exact opposite of conciliation. Now, notice that Russia has basically ignored this because the word out today is that they're looking forward to finding a date next week where they can meet. But while the United States, I think, is going to portray this as Russia coming hand in hand, begging for a deal, I think it's the exact opposite. It is Russia trying to avert a nuclear war, because that's certainly where we're headed. That the belligerence that's increasingly coming from the leaders of Europe, coupled with the actions of Donald Trump and his government. As I pointed out in several recent podcasts and in pieces I've written at Sonar 21, we've had a series of actions, really go back to June 1st, with the spiderweb attack on the strategic basis of and the strategic air force of Russia, followed up 2 weeks later by the decapitation strike in Iran. The reason I link those two together is that the same kinds of techniques of drones that were carted into country, hidden in a truck, and then launched at target, it was used in both cases, which suggests this was a coordinated effort that involved U.S. intelligence, both U.S. intelligence involved in attacks on Russia and attacks on Iran. That was followed then by two events, 3 weeks ago, with one, the reintroduction of nuclear weapons into Europe, weapons that had been withdrawn, nuclear weapons that had been withdrawn back in 2008, now were reintroduced by Trump. Now, it was a B-61-12 gravity bomb. Lakenheath, I called it Lakenfield mistakenly yesterday, but it was Lakenheath airfield in the UK, as well as at least five others in NATO partners throughout Europe. Now, the gravity bomb itself is not a first strike weapon. You got to put it on a plane, and the plane has to fly into Russia, and Russia's got a robust air defense system, which makes it unlikely that could be delivered. Nonetheless, it's still putting a nuclear device in Europe in a way that it never has before. And then in tandem with that, the commander of the European Command for the United States, USUCOM, Christopher Donahue, speaking at a NATO meeting, specifically talked about NATO plans for invading Kaliningrad and taking it over. Kaliningrad is an exclave of Russia and is considered as a very sensitive strategic part of Russia. So to have a U.S. general openly talking about attacking Kaliningrad without justification, without rationale, without provocation on the part of Russia, sends another signal that the West not only has carried out attacks through proxies inside Russia, but they continue to talk about it. They're putting in place nuclear weapons. They're announcing military plans for conquering territory. All of that is viewed, I think, with justifiable alarm, or should be, by Russia. I don't think these are idle gestures. These are legitimate threats to Russia. But the United States, despite these threatening actions, and I forgot the last one was Trump getting trolled by Medvidev, and in response to a Medvedev social media post, Trump felt it necessary to say that he was deploying submarines off the coast of Russia in order to put them on notice that they could be hit with nuclear weapons. Well, again, Russia, at least the Russian leadership outwardly sort of shrugged their shoulders, because they said, what is he talking about? There are already submarines in place with those weapon systems. I think this was more for Trump and his insecurity, trying to play the tough guy with the American public. But when you're dealing with someone with those kinds of, let's call it insecurities, narcissistic behavior, and then his advanced age, because he's starting to show signs of what I'll call mental fatigue, if nothing else, a tendency to confabulate, to tell stories as fully believing that they're true, even though they're not true. Um, that is historically within the Trump family, there has been dementia, and dementia along those lines, where we could be seeing the early start of that with Trump. But it comes back to it. We have to ask the question: is Trump thinking strategically about how to deal with the world? Now, I know some of my friends argue, "Oh, yes, he is. He's playing 5D chess." I don't think he could line up checkers on a checkerboard right now, because this declaring Russia as a threat, because it's a threat, to then justify uh, imposing sanctions on India. It looks good in the press, that it feeds the narrative that Trump is a tough guy. But when you look at the actual economic data in terms of U.S. India trade relations, we discover that India's trade with the United States only counts for about 2% of India's GDP. And the annual exports are around $87 billion. When you look at if you try to, I know there have been some impact assessments of what would happen when the imposition of these tariffs. It's likely only to affect 19%, 0.2% really of the GDP in India. So it's economically insignificant. But what it does is it has angered the Indians. The Indians thought they actually had a pretty good relationship with Washington. And in attacking India in this way, what's happened in the last since this announcement, India has withdrawn, canceled an order to purchase planes from the United States. It is also Modi is now going to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. Given the rancorous relationship between India and China over the last 6 years, despite being members of BRICS, there still have been tensions between them. And I would argue that terrorist attack that took place now 3 months ago in the Kashmir region, I believe that was a Western-backed intelligence operation designed to heighten tensions between China and India. Fortunately, that war was concluded quickly, and India and China are talking. They're not fighting, and they're not trading insults. They are actually moving in a direction of, it appears, greater cooperation. When you step back and look at what Trump's been doing with tariffs, it's implied that this is about trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think what we're witnessing is an attempt by Donald Trump to attack BRICS. Notice that the tariffs have been primarily directed against Brazil, now India, and China. But Trump's attack on BRICS is backfiring. Instead of weakening support among the BRICS members and putting them in a situation where it's every country for itself and seeking its own self-interest, it turns out that the self-interest of the countries is being best served by increased trade. So as a result of the tariffs that the United States imposed, particularly on coffee, well, lo and behold, Brazil turned around and has cut a deal with China and is going to be exporting more coffee to China, not to the United States. The United States did a carve out on orange juice because orange juice was a major import from Brazil. But we've seen then in the last 24 hours a call by Lula, the president of Brazil, to the other BRICS members that they need to meet and cooperate and coordinate more closely in countering the U.S. economic bullying that's taking place. We're seeing similar sentiments out of India, and China already has been in a position of refusing to send rare earth minerals to allow the U.S. defense industry to continue to operate and to limit the export of magnets. Both China, India, and Brazil together, along with Russia, represent formidable economies that the United States, I think, is desperate trying to disrupt BRICS, because there's at least some, I think, in the Trump administration, and maybe Trump himself recognizes that the emergence of BRICS is going to eliminate the leverage the United States has wielded over other countries and its ability to control or seem to control world events. BRICS I would argue that U.S. actions, these antagonistic actions, these aggressive efforts to try to punish people economically through both sanctions, to tariffs, it's backfiring. Instead of dividing these countries, it's creating a greater unity. Likewise, sort of what happened by the United States deciding to back Israel's attack on Iran and facilitate Israel's attack on Iran. Instead of isolating Iran, it has brought Iran greater support in the global south. Just recall 10 years ago when the JCPOA was being negotiated, Iran was isolated. Iran was facing, even China and Russia were willing to sign on to European proposed sanctions, snapback sanctions. That is not the case now. Today, Iran is firmly placed in the BRICS orbit, working very closely with both Russian and Chinese authorities, both on defense as well as on diplomatic and economic areas as well. So it is a sea change that is taking place, and the growth of BRICS has been accelerated, I would argue, by the special military operation and the West's reaction to Russia. So, which brings us back to what could happen next week in the meeting with Donald Trump. I see Vladimir Putin being very calm and laying out very clearly what Russia's position is and explaining how Russia has been a target of the West, going back to as early as 1995, when the West began to cultivate Ukraine as a NATO member, a de facto NATO member, and the continued efforts of the West in funding the terrorist war in Chechnya, the second terrorist war, funding and supporting radical Islamists that were attacking and killing Russian citizens, the efforts to the war that was provoked with Georgia in 2008, where Georgia was emboldened to try to join NATO and to attack Russia, to attack the Russian soldiers who were providing peacekeeping duties in the Ossetia region, followed by the coup, the U.S. and UK-backed coup in February 2014 in Kiev, and then continued to fund the war effort that has been attacking Russian-speaking citizens as well as attacking Russians. If the shoe was on the other foot, if the events I've described were done by Russia to the United States, I guarantee you we would have already probably been in the midst of a nuclear war. This would have escalated quickly. Putin, to his credit, and the Russians, general staff and as well, have shown extraordinary patience in not succumbing to the temptation to expand this war. But while it is good news that Trump and Putin will meet, it is not likely that there's going to come out of there with Russia agreeing to a ceasefire. Russia will only agree to a ceasefire when the conditions that Vladimir Putin laid out in his June 2024 presentation before the foreign ministry are met. And I would argue that if he backs away from that, if he surrenders on those issues, Putin, the West will finally get what they want. They'll get rid of Putin. I think Putin's political position in Russia would be at risk. I don't see Putin doing that. But he is going to make the case that Russia's legitimate security interests must be taken into account. Anyway, that's my assessment. I thank you for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll be back next week with Alistair Crook to talk about the latest developments in Russia and in West Asia. Thanks for watching. I'm Larry Johnson. This is Countercurrents.